Oh, what happened there? Oh, right. Okay, up and down, up and down. Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, we got, okay. So as people are still doing it, let's take a look and see who we've got in the room. So I think the top one there is homelessness charities. If we want to scroll up a little bit, homelessness charities seem to be quite well represented here today, unsurprisingly. We have some friends from the Home Office here. Other types of charities, do look. Not many people from migrant rights organisations yet. So either you're not here or you're very, very slow at getting to Slido and putting your options in there. Okay. All right. So lots of different people in the room. Good. Well, that's good to know just to get us started. So just to say a little bit about the event today, this is part of our frontline network work that we do with St. Martin's in the Field, who run the frontline network, where they have partner organisations, and the role of those partner organisations is to support and build capacity in organisations which are working with homeless people. So Praxis is the London partner, and our network is a thematic network working with organisations that help migrants who are homeless. But if you're in London and you're working in homelessness, you will be helping migrants who are homeless, because as we all know, migrants make up a significant proportion of rough sleepers in London, and immigration status can be a key risk factor potentially in homelessness. And we all know that immigration status also complicates ending homelessness for people. So that's why we run that network. And we then have quarterly events, which we look at some of the issues and try and unpick them. And then every year or every other year, we have a larger event like this conference, where we look at the events together and we look at some possible solutions. And we also ask some people from statutory organisations to be in the room, both so that they can contribute, but also so that they can listen and hear what's going on the front line and feed that back and hopefully do something about it. Someone mentioned earlier speaking truth to power, and sometimes at these events I think, oh God, if anyone mentions speaking truth to power one more time, I'm going to scream. But we are in a Quaker meeting house, and it is a key part of the Quaker philosophy about speaking truth to power. So hopefully we can do a bit of that today. But our aims in general are to look at the rough sleeping strategy, how it addresses migrant destitution outstanding challenges, to look at the impact of Home Office policies on homelessness, to share learning and good practice in addressing migrant homelessness, and to launch and promote the sub-regional immigration advice service for rough sleepers and people at risk of homelessness. And to come back to that title there, Ending Migrant Homelessness for Good. Well, I don't think we're going to get that done by 4:30, unfortunately. However, much as I might joke about that, I think that what we should do today is not take it as just we're never going to do that. I think we should actually try and believe that we can end migrant homelessness. We know it is possible. We know we can do these things. So we might not do it by 4:30. We might not do it this year. We might have these conferences for a couple more years yet. But what I would like to see is that steadily, as we start having these conferences, fewer and fewer people come, until one day I say, I'm going to have a conference on migrant homelessness, and someone says, why do you need a conference on migrant homelessness? So I think that's our ultimate aim today, to actually stop us from having these conferences eventually. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Tom Copley, who is the Deputy Mayor of London with a special remit for housing. So Tom, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to speak this morning. And it's great to be kicking off a conference with such a fantastic range of speakers. I think it's going to be very enlightening. And the first thing I should say as well is thank you so much to Praxis for all the work that you are doing with migrant communities. Now, I've got my notes on my Surface Pro, so we're just going to see how this goes in the spirit of saving paper. But the increase in people sleeping rough on London streets is extremely concerning. The Mayor has called for urgent action to tackle the spiralling cost of living that threatens to force even more Londoners out of their homes and onto the streets. On Monday, the Mayor hosted an emergency summit on private renting at City Hall. Spiralling rents and insecurity in the private rented sector threaten to make even more people homeless this winter. One London borough recently told me that their homelessness applications were up by 1/3 this year, and they regularly have queues of people outside their offices. So Sadiq is calling for a 2-year rent freeze for private tenants and for the government to urgently bring forward long-promised legislation to end no-fault eviction for private tenants. We cannot end rough sleeping for good without addressing migrant homelessness. Around half of all rough sleepers in London are non-UK nationals. Many non-UK nationals who are rough sleeping have full entitlements in the UK, and their move-on options should be similar to those of UK nationals. However, for those with uncertain or limited entitlements to public funds, it can be very difficult to find appropriate move-on support due to current policy and legal restrictions. Moreover, there are additional challenges to supporting non-UK rough sleepers with uncertain entitlements, from difficulties evidencing and understanding their immigration status to delays in getting decisions from immigration or benefits authorities, and challenges accessing accommodation and support services that meet their needs. In recent years, there has been fantastic work from all partners to address many of those challenges. Everyone In enabled us to provide immediate accommodation to anyone who was on the streets, and this included many who initially had restricted eligibility and who, through specialists and intensive support, have been able to resolve their immigration needs and move on positively. There are multiple examples of good practice developed through this period, including the excellent work in the Pan-London hotels and a host of new projects that have recently started building from that great work. This includes specialist projects commissioned under the Mayor's Life Off the Streets programme, such as the Roma Rough Sleepers team, which provides specialist support by culturally competent Roma mediators to support Roma rough sleepers to find routes off the streets. Last year, the Mayor also funded a number of specialist services through the Immigration Advice for Rough Sleepers Fund, delivering immigration advice to help rough sleeping non-UK nationals determine their rights and entitlements. This year, the Mayor secured, together with London councils, £4.9 million of funding from the government's Rough Sleeping Initiative to fund 4 sub-regional immigration advice services in London. These services will be able to deliver the largest immigration advice offer for people sleeping rough in London yet. In the afternoon today, there will be an opportunity for attendees to meet representatives from these new services. These exciting projects are proof of what can be achieved when all relevant partners and sectors work together to find solutions to common goals. We've seen a fantastic increase in collaborative work between the migrant and homelessness sectors in the past 2 years. This is reflected in the positive work of the GLA's Homeless Migrant Advisory Panel, an expert group bringing together both sectors to advise on issues related to street homelessness among non-UK nationals in London. This panel influences the work not only of the GLA's internal teams, but also that of the Life Off the Streets group. Together with London councils, I chair the Life Off the Streets Executive Board to bring together partners key to tackling rough sleeping in London, including migrant rough sleeping. The board exists to drive and make a success of our shared ambition to prevent rough sleeping wherever possible, and when this is not possible, to make sure that it is rare, brief, and a non-recurrent event in London. We're working in partnership to advance national and local policy, ensure the sustainability of effective programs and initiatives, and communicate impact, standards, and best practice. Through this group, we are expanding or monitoring the impact of the exciting projects I mentioned earlier, as well as other positive initiatives such as the escalation of pending immigration cases. Many of the key partners in the group are at the conference today. Whilst we may not currently have all the levers to meet our aim of ending rough sleeping, we must continue to work together to build on the positive work of the last few years. However, we also need to bring our collective effort to tackle some challenging issues that continue to limit our ability to support homeless migrants to find a sustainable route off the streets. Today should be an opportunity to do both. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fantastic introduction, which I think has really set the scene very well for this conference today. My name is Sally Dagley and I'm the Chief Executive of Praxis, and it's a real delight to see so many people here from different sectors, from local authorities, from government, and of course from the front line, people who are working every day to support people out of homelessness. And I think it's a really kind of historic moment for us, because I don't think we could have had this kind of conference five years ago. I think we have come from a place where largely the rhetoric around homelessness and homeless migrants was that people somehow had done something bad or wrong and shouldn't be here, and therefore were not being helped to leave the streets. And Praxis is not a homelessness organisation. We're an organisation which has worked for nearly 40 years supporting migrant communities in London, working with people, trying to address the challenges that they face in all aspects of their lives. But probably about 2014, we began our work and our journey in addressing migrant homelessness, because more and more people were presenting to Praxis who were on the streets or who were on the cusp of homelessness and had major difficulties in either avoiding homelessness or getting out of that. We were working particularly with a lot of older people. Many of them have been here for many years and had come here as children. And that work with those people led to and contributed to the unveiling of what became known as the Windrush scandal. I'm really glad that I know there are some people from the Home Office today who are still working to try and right some of those wrongs. In this first section of the conference, we're going to follow on from that introduction by Tom to some of the amazing work that's been happening here in London. And I think we can probably all get behind his statement that homelessness, personally, there are always going to be things that can happen in any of our lives that might precipitate homelessness, but it should be rare, brief, and non-recurrent. And I'm delighted that we have a panel here that incorporates Jake Dowse, who's come with, I have to say, the most difficult title I've ever had to get my tongue around, but he's the team leader of the non-UK Nationals Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Directorate at the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. Who's going to talk to us about the government's rough sleeping strategy, which we really welcome. We really welcome the emphasis on prevention, the inclusion of migrants within its scope. So we're looking forward to hearing much more about that and talking to colleagues throughout the day. Of course, as Bethan said in her introduction, at Praxis, we're also very concerned about the drivers of migrant homelessness and the blocks to ending it. And we're hoping that this conference today will particularly enthuse government colleagues to go back and talk to other departments about some of those drivers of migrant homelessness, because I think if we cannot turn off the tap, we will never find a lasting solution. We also have on the panel Michelle Binfield, who's the Programme Director of London Councils and leading the Life Off the Streets partnership, which Tom referred to. And Fiona Colley from Homeless Link. I know many of your organisations are members of Homeless Link, and Fiona is the Director of Social Change, leading on policy and campaigning work. Before I hand over to Jake, just to say for those of you that don't know about what Praxis does, our work isn't just focused on homelessness, but we have developed, I think, a niche expertise there. We're an organisation that provides direct services. We provide particularly legal advice and support to about 2,000 people a year in London. We work to build the capacity, which is why we are involved in things like this conference and in training. but we're also involved in campaigning for policy change and influencing. And we do that in partnership with the real experts, people with lived experience of the policies about which we talk. And I know people are going to be involved in speaking in many of the other events today. So without further ado, and hoping I haven't gone too much over my timing, I think we have a Slido question to start us off. Is that okay? So this is, what do you see as the biggest barrier to achieving the strategic objective of ending rough sleeping amongst migrants? Which is going to lead us. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. 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 Above. Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, we have a lot of all of the above, but in a slight change from the initial 100% Home Office policy to 60%. So we have some wavering here. Okay, do we have a deadline for answers? As fascinating as it is, I'm sure we'd all like to really hear about this rough sleeping strategy. So Jake, can I hand over?
Sure. Can
to
people
you.
hear me at the back? Was okay. Sure. Yeah, great. So I mean, first, thanks so much for having me. We're working? Yeah, oh, great. So first, just thanks so much for having me here at the conference, and echo some of the words that I think, Tom, you said about the value of gathering people here today for dialogue, and Bethan on sort of some of the speaking truth to power. It's really good to, as government, be in the room for this type of discussion. I've been asked to say a few words about the recent rough sleeping strategy that we published back in September, and some of the measures it sets out in relation to migrant homelessness. I confess I probably had a bit of a different answer on the other to that question. So hopefully I'll do kind of a job of explaining what the answer of the rough sleeping strategy is to that. I think first it's worth setting out, as again, Tom did as well, the rough sleeping strategy in the context of the pandemic and some of the lessons that were learned in relation to the support for people with restricted eligibility who would have otherwise been eligible for statutory assistance in terms of accommodation and wider support. We know that, again, many of those individuals who were accommodated and supported during that period went on to achieve long-term and sustainable outcomes off the street. We've seen examples of applications for status through the EU settlement scheme, individuals being supported into employment as well. I think those experiences pose a challenge for government, which is some of what we've had to think about when developing a new strategy and how it had moved on from 2018 when we published our last strategy, as well as reflecting the manifesto commitment to end rough sleeping by the end of the Parliament. In particular, I think emphasising the need to talk about migrant rough sleeping in a bit more of a nuanced way, hence kind of us using the term restricted eligibility to reflect some of the nuance of the cohort, which maybe beforehand by government was talked about as a homogenous group. And also the government's role in supporting the sorts of successful partnerships that we saw during that period. And I guess that would be sort of my main answer to that sort of central question about the strategic challenges about that partnership, of which kind of this conference is important, but also how that works across government and at a local level. Part of our response to that has been sort of underlining our ask that local authorities and local partners continue to exhaust all the options within the law to support the group in the same way that was done over the pandemic. To say the obvious, there's been quite a lot of change in government recently. It's early days with new ministers. The strategy was published in September, but the government's commitment continues to be to end rough sleeping by the end of the Parliament. That doesn't underestimate the scale of the challenge, and particularly the barriers and complexities to supporting non-UK national and migrant rough sleepers. We know this is a key challenge for delivering that ambition. So I'll try and outline kind of briefly, I think, two of the kind of central things about the strategy that try and build on those learnings from the pandemic, specifically in relation to migrant rough sleeping. First is a little bit more about the definition that we set out of what it actually means to end rough sleeping. Both Tom and Sally have mentioned that definition, but I'll go into a bit more detail about that and why I think it's important for this conference. And second, then a little bit more about sort of the cross-government nature of the strategy and partnership role, particularly of Home Office, something that we know is particularly important given the wider challenges and pressures on the immigration system, asylum system as well, and how that can support partnership at a local level. I don't want to preempt some of the things that Home Office colleagues will want to say in sort of later sessions, but I'll do my best to kind of do a brief sketch of that. So first, the strategy sets out for the first time a clear definition of what it means to end rough sleeping that's practical and real. And that is that rough sleeping is ended if it is prevented or otherwise rare, brief and non-recurrent. And part of that is a recognition that just focusing on a single night snapshot doesn't capture the nuance of what it would mean to truly end rough sleeping. And I think that's particularly the case for migrant rough sleepers, where we know there are challenges supporting people with restricted eligibility for statutory support into long-term accommodation and sustained recovery from the street. And part of our work in defining an end to rough sleeping is also developing a framework that's being piloted, including in London. But it's important to note that that framework includes some specific indicators about long-term accommodation and the length of time between the first time someone is sleeping out and moving into long-term accommodation, the number of people experiencing rough sleeping that's sustained and recurrent, as well as how many people are seen sleeping rough after having left an institution, and that includes the asylum system. So there's a recognition that a new definition also tries to capture some of those nuances that many people in this room will see in sort of frontline work with rough sleepers who are migrants. I think that's an important step as well in terms of definition to trying to align efforts across government and local partners to make ending rough sleeping a reality. But I think it's also important in terms of building our understanding of what those drivers for rough sleeping for different groups are, including migrants. Second, as I said, the strategy also sets out a framework for cross-government partnership in delivering an end to rough sleeping, setting out a number of joint commitments between the Home Office and DLUC. I'll sort of run through sort of the three central ones now, but sort of welcome kind of questions and discussions about sort of specifics after as well. First, we know that migrants at risk of rough sleeping may have a pathway to regularising their immigration status and accessing statutory services. Tom, you mentioned this in kind of your opening words, and that is reflected in the strategy as something that needs partnership between Home Office, DLUC and local partners. First, the strategy reiterates the commitment to reform the rough sleeping support service to fulfil its aim of swiftly clarifying and resolving the immigration status of non-UK nationals, including moving the service out of immigration enforcement, which is something that has already happened at the start of this month. And we have some colleagues here from the Chief Caseworker Unit who now deal with that service. We know that there are still challenges. We want to kind of continue to work to make improvements to that service, but importantly, build on the work that we've seen at local level through Home Office escalating pending immigration applications, and as well it being complemented by the funding that DLUC has set out through the Rough Sleeping Initiative, some of which has funded immigration advice services in areas, again, which Tom has mentioned at the start. Second, we also know that reconnection can be an effective way off the streets for individuals, but we also know that that doesn't happen and that migrant rough sleepers face barriers to reconnection internationally in too many cases. Again, the approach set out is cross-government. We've set out a joint commitment in the strategy with Home Office to introduce an offer of tailored support for those who wish to return to their home country. This bill builds partly on the support available through the voluntary return scheme that the Home Office currently run and the support available there, but it also is a recognition that there is far more work done and important work done at a local level that addresses the specific barriers that many rough sleepers have in reconnecting internationally, whether that's reintegration into their home country or whether that's addressing needs before they make their return. Third, the cross-government approach with Home Office also dovetails the emphasis on prevention that runs through the strategy. The strategy as a whole sets out a prevention-first approach, which includes an ambition that no one is released from a public institution to the streets, whether that's a hospital, prison, the care system, or the asylum system. We know it's only through a partnership with Home Office that we're going to address the challenges with the latter. We've set out in the strategy that the government has a commitment to continuing to look closely at the impact of the asylum dispersal system. And we want to continue to work with local authorities, organisations such as yourselves, to understand what long-term reform of that system could look like, both to ensure that dispersal is equitable, sustainable, but also that it prevents individuals from exiting accommodation support onto the streets, which we know happens currently. I'll stop there, but would really welcome sort of discussion kind of questions. Again, sort of, really sort of welcome sort of this conference, as I've said, particularly in terms of how it both builds on the pandemic response and how government can support local partnerships on the ground. Looking forward to discussions throughout the ZAM meeting, more of you as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jake. That was great. I think it's really so positive to hear that we have now a much more nuanced approach, because if we don't have that, then we can't find the solutions. And there are huge challenges in terms of pathways to regularization. But I think the area that we need to also look at is the things that are pushing people in the opposite direction. And there are many aspects of Home Office policy and practice that I think are pushing people into an undocumented status and putting them at risk of homelessness. There is an opportunity to ask questions. We're going to take questions from the floor as well as questions online. But I'd ask you to save your questions for Jake so that we can now hear from Michelle, who's the Programme Director at London Councils, leading this Life Off the Streets partnership. So the floor is yours. Thanks, you,
Sally.
Michelle.
Can you hear me okay? Cool. Yes, I'm fortunate enough to be able to programme manage the Life Off the Streets programme in London. I look very young, but I've been doing this for many decades. First job out of university, I worked in a hostel where we lived in and didn't get paid very much. And I think, despite my Black Country accent being very dour, that we're in a really good place. So I'm going to be very positive, notwithstanding that there are challenges. The strategy is really, really important, as is the programme. Our programme reflects the strategy, which is the work we're doing together in London. It's not just councils, not just the mayor, but the NHS, homelessness charities, migrant organisations, the DWP, the Ministry of Justice, London Probation. They're all there, the rogues gallery of pictures at the front of the rough sleeping strategy, if you sleep with it under your pillow like I do. And I think we're in a really good place, because what we know from the work that we did during the pandemic, and people have referenced, is that this is not a housing issue. And if we don't have the right people in the room, we've got no chance. Rough sleeping was never a housing issue, actually, in all the time I've worked in rough sleeping. So the programme builds on two things. One is the Life Off the Streets task force, which the mayor chaired, which GLA brought together and very much drove and created a lot of the energy and drive. And then second to that, London local authorities, when the pandemic hit and everyone in was created and we were told to get all homeless people off the streets, local authority chief execs, for whom rough sleeping would have been a sort of smaller issue in the past, and London housing directors came together, and at one point we're meeting weekly, something called a rough sleeping strategy group, to just try and figure out how to do this, everyone in, and how to make it work. So we had two sets of stakeholders working in parallel, as often happens in our sector. And then in the summer of 2021, the programme was created to bring all of that energy together, to meld those two parallel pieces of work and to get everybody in a room. And that programme now is ambitious, it's huge, it's got a lot of drive and momentum. And in London, under the auspices of that programme, many of our partners and across government and not in government are doing really great work. So I just wanted to explain what that programme is. You know, we're looking at data, we're looking at women's homelessness, we're looking at young people, we're looking at workforce issues, we're looking at non-UK migrant issues. There's a tremendous amount of work going on. And the pandemic has been horrible, truly horrible. But in rough sleeping terms, it's given us a massive opportunity. Thousands of people in London were brought off the streets during Everyone In. The Protect and Vaccinate programme of last winter enabled us to house even more people. And what it taught us is some really important lessons, which as the pandemic sort of fades away, no, I'm not quite sure about that, we can't lose the lessons, we can't lose what we learned worked over the period of the pandemic and Everyone In. So I just wanted to touch on a few of those things by way of prompting a bit of discussion, really. Colleagues, it's an obvious thing to say, but accommodation really matters. You know, what we learned during the pandemic is that bringing people into accommodation makes them and their issues extremely visible, gives us much more clarity, much more evidence, and it also makes it a lot easier to support people. I mean, they're bloody obvious things, but during the pandemic, we could show if you bring migrant rough sleepers with uncertain or restricted eligibility into accommodation in a way that wasn't available to them before the pandemic, then you can do really good work. You can get employment outcomes, you can get immigration status sorted, you can get people into benefits and into housing. And the work of partners across the pandemic achieved that for lots of people. And as we move forward, local authorities are finding it harder without Protect and Vaccinate funding and without Everyone In to afford to provide accommodation for people who are in a place where they can't claim benefits yet, but they need to be inside while we work with them on their issues. In London, we've got, you'll hear about it later, the Sub-Regional Immigration Advice Services, and we've asked DLUC and they gave it to us for a pot of funding to be attached to those services. And what we're finding is having people in accommodation, even if it's short term, while they begin their journey towards sorting out their eligibility, it's really critical, and working quite hard with non-commissioned partners, with local authorities, with support providers to make sure we have a variety of accommodations still available. The other thing that came up during the pandemic was this notion of exhausting all options. And it's three words, kind of trite if you make it trite, but exhausting all options. If you mean it, it absolutely has to be the way that we go forward together with this group in the future. Exhausting all options is exactly the right thing we should do. You know, we should look at, is there a Care Act need? You know, is there a non-commissioned service provider that could offer hosting? Is there some entitlement to benefits that if we fight for and we get the right advice in place, we can secure that? Have we got good quality immigration advice that's meaning that we're absolutely certain that we've exhausted all of the options that are available to a person? So the guidance that was produced on the back of that statement by the minister to exhaust all options, please, before you allow people to sleep rough, we owe it to ourselves, as we did during the pandemic, to make it absolutely real. Within the programme, we're doing work with adult social care directors to get them clearer about what they can offer, what their powers are, what the Care Act could offer. We're doing work with local authorities around making sure that the housing advice, the housing offer, the front door is open to migrant homeless people, and that you don't have frontline staff saying we can't help you because you've got NRPF, you know, that you do a proper assessment. So they're all things that I think that we learned during the pandemic. That point that I think was made by Jake is a really important one. When it says inadequate local responses, I was kind of happy because I'm like a local response person, and it didn't score very high. So it's gone and made me feel satisfied. But to be controversial, we have some inadequate local responses, let's be honest. You know, we commission services where the expertise around immigration in outreach services or in day centres or in other settings isn't as good as it should be. You know, half of our rough sleepers, as Tom said, are non-UK. This isn't just like a little group, you know, that we can afford to neglect and not be good at dealing with. And there is still, I hear it and I see it, and we're trying to challenge it through training, through practice, through sharing of what works, a conflation between non-UK and NRPF. I can't do anything for that person, so I'm not even going to try. And we're driving that out of our local services and our local responses with the training, with the support of people like Praxis, with the expertise that's growing. But it's really important that we do that work and we don't rest on our laurels. And the other thing is we've got a tremendous amount of investment in immigration advice in London, thanks to DLUC. The £1 billion they're putting into rough sleeping, we shouldn't hesitate to be grateful. Think about it, it's a lot of money. Some of the issues we're grappling with now, we're grappling with them because some of the core stuff is so well managed, so well funded, and is working so well that we're able to dig into things like women who are hidden from sight and do a women's census. We're able to look at some of the things that in the past we would have been scrabbling around trying to just meet the very core needs. And now we're on the edges of the really difficult stuff. We're having conversations about that difficult stuff in a way we haven't for decades. The data, the prevention stuff that's in the strategy, this focus on preventing the flow of new rough sleepers. Some of us have been saying that for literally decades, but now we have a government and a strategy and funding that is enabling us to lift our eyes up and look at those wicked problems in a way that we haven't been able to before. So the prevention focus, I think, is the thing that comes next. You know, that is the important work. And to really understand prevention, we need better data. And that is work that we are doing within the programme in London, linking up the H-click data that local authorities have with the chain data, with the support provider data, and trying to just better understand why it is that some people in housing need sleep rough and some people don't. And we need that data to be able to properly prevent rough sleeping going forward. And one of the ways in which we know we're achieving success is through all that investment in immigration advice. We're finding other problems. So we get status, then the DWP fall down on the job and don't do what they need to or give a negative decision, and we're doing 50% mandatory reconsideration. So as we achieve success and as we move through the problems and try and sort things out, we then get into this space of saying, well, let's meet with DWP, let's try and improve that. We've got to a place with the Home Office where we can escalate decisions. We had tremendous success with the escalation process. We look forward to working with the new team who are going to be escalating. But we can't just rest there. There is employment, there is benefits, there is what comes next, tenancy sustainment. So for me, yes, we have a cost of living crisis. Yes, it's going to hit migrant people harder. The thousands of pounds you have to pay to extend visas, the insecure work, sometimes the insecure tenancies. But if we are, you know, sort of paddling upstream against that sort of difficult prevailing condition, we at least are in a, I can't even kill this metaphor, I don't even know how to finish it. We're in a good boat. We're all rowing in the same direction, and it could be a lot worse. We could be facing that cost of living crisis. Thank goodness I didn't do a tsunami thing. But we could be facing that crisis in a much worse shape than we are now going into this situation that is to come. I really look forward to questions. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. I think that's, you know, absolutely amazing how this work has developed and how we really now have got an integrated approach, bringing together government and local authorities and health, and obviously pointing out that, yes, it never was just a housing issue. And I think one of the biggest challenges historically has been this conflation in terms of migrant homelessness, the conflation between being a non-UK national and being assumed to have no rights and no recourse to public funds. And I think there's just such amazing kind of creativity and energy going into this work in London, and I know that Praxis is really proud to be part of that and helping to inform it. We're going to move on now and hear from our final panelist, from Fiona, who's going to talk a bit about the recommendations from the Kernskale Commission, which looked at what we needed to do to end rough sleeping and homelessness, and give us a policy view from a Homeless Link, which represents organisations working on homelessness. And I think Fiona and Homeless Link were key contributors to that commission. So we really look forward to hearing your take on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sally, and I'd like to echo the comments of others of how important it is to have such a mixed audience, to have people here from government, from regional government, and from the sector. And good to hear so much optimism. I have to say, I perhaps might be slightly less optimistic, because I think it's important to also recognise the very significant challenges and some things around immigration that, frankly, on a frequent and regular basis make me very angry. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room, in fact, very angry. Homeless Link, it's good to see from the slide how many of you are from homelessness charities. So I suspect many of you will know that we're the national membership charity for organisations working with homeless people in England. I haven't got the clicker, so I'm not sure who's controlling it. So our vision is a country free from homelessness. We've got over 900 members across England. If we just flip to the next slide, we'll be quick with this. We work with our members to make services better, but also vitally, we work to be a strong voice for our membership and to campaign in partnership for policy change that will help to end homelessness. For us, one of those priority areas is making change for non-UK nationals, and in particular, people with restricted eligibility. People with restricted or undetermined eligibility for public funds are particularly vulnerable to homelessness, and meaningful solutions to homelessness for these people have long felt like the missing piece of the puzzle. We simply will not end homelessness or rough sleeping without addressing this both nationally and locally. We've been doing our own research and policy work in partnership with NACOM, and one of my colleagues, Sophie Bubis, is here in the room, and she's going to be running a workshop a bit later more about our research. And this morning, I'm going to talk a bit more about one of the most important partnership projects that we're involved with, which is the Kernskale Commission on Homelessness and Rough Sleeping. So the Kernskale Commission was established in March 2021 to learn what happened, what worked, what and why during the pandemic, and to provide a roadmap for ending rough sleeping. It's chaired by Lord Bob Kernskale, formerly head of the Civil Service, formerly a local authority chief executive, and now a crossbench peer, very influential individual. But I really want to recognise that the driving force behind the commission was Steve Douglas, the chief executive of St Mungo's, who very tragically died earlier this year. The commission and its ongoing work are very much his legacy. The commission's greatest strength is it really brings together leaders across multiple sectors in homelessness, organisations like ourselves, but also housing, local authorities, health leaders, and people with lived experience. Its recommendations and assessments of progress are really respected and taken very seriously at government level. And the Commission didn't end its work when it published its report last year. It's gone on to examine the progress that's been made with a follow-up report that came out this September, and it's committed to do at least one further follow-up progress report next September. The Commission's work is really substantial and wide-ranging, so I really recommend visiting their website if you haven't seen their full recommendations. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus in on its findings and recommendations on migrant rough sleeping. So the Commission took evidence from over 90 organisations and drew on work across the sector, including our work at Homeless Link. They highlighted the facts that I'm sure a lot of people in this room are very familiar with, that we've heard already, that around 50% of people sleeping rough in London are non-UK nationals and getting on for a quarter in England, according to the 2020 annual count. But both of these figures are most likely an underestimate, and that was recognised in the report, because we know that there is a significant level of hidden homelessness amongst non-UK nationals. what we found in the Commission is that professional immigration advice and support is absolutely essential, and that resolution is too slow, in part due to complexity, but also because of slow decision making at the Home Office. And we found there were significant issues for people leaving the asylum system, with support ending after 28 days following a decision and no duty to refer on the Home Office. The Commission concluded that everyone in was a success because it applied to everyone, regardless of their immigration status. And I would put that really more strongly. The provision of universal accessible accommodation was a game changer for the resolution of immigration cases and homelessness. People cannot focus on their immigration needs and their status if they don't know where they're going to be sleeping tonight. It's simply not possible. And sadly, the legal restrictions and some local decision making about what support could be provided returned all too quickly following everyone in. We had some great work in London in particular. I do want to praise London that continued to provide support for a very long time. But I'm also aware from our work across England that there were other areas where non-UK nationals with restricted eligibility were back out on the streets by the autumn of 2020. It is not a consistent picture across the country. So where local authorities have chosen to continue to provide accommodation, we really have seen remarkable results, but there's a lot more work to be done to see that happening. So moving to the 2021 recommendations, the Commission made a real raft of recommendations for national change. I'm going to focus on national here because there are sessions on local recommendations later. I want to pick out just a few of those. On benefits and advice, the Commission was calling for a level of support to avoid causing destitution, effectively calling for an end to this idea that it would be all right for someone to have no recourse to public funds in any situation. They were looking for investment in good quality independent immigration, welfare, employment advice and support, and vitally for a simpler and faster immigration process. A further point that I think is really important to pick out from there is real clear national guidance on what support local areas could and should to provide for local funds. Michelle's right, exhaust all options is exactly what we want, but the interpretation of what it means to exhaust all options is very variable across different local areas. And what we currently have is a real postcode lottery of what it means and what support people will be able to access. So a year on, what progress have we made? Moving on to the next slide. I do really want to be positive. There are some positives. I want to emphasize those. We have really seen excellent working relationships with officials in DLUC, and engagement with the Home Office is immensely improved. And I do want to be clear that we appreciate that because it can be very tempting. As I said, I get quite angry when I read some of the things in the newspaper, when I hear about people being left at Victoria Station. I get very angry, and it can be very tempting from the outside to just rage against a system that is broken and is causing terrible and devastating harm. But we will only make change by meeting each other where we are, engaging and persuading, and that is on us as a sector as well as on government. We have seen progress on RSI funding, particularly for immigration advice. The Home Office is a signatory to that new rough sleeping strategy that Jacob told us about. And the Home Office is making good moves to move rough sleeping support service out of enforcement and have that commitment to escalating and expediting cases for people experiencing rough sleeping. So we are making progress, but I can't sugarcoat it. There has been little or no progress against quite a lot of the recommendations, and the Commission has rated progress as red amber. The national policy agenda, the environment is increasingly hostile, and the data is showing that migrant rough sleeping is on the rise. So what now? The Commission has restated its recommendations, put those on the next slide, highlighting some of the most important. That clarity for local areas on what support they may provide is really needed. We need clear guidance on what exhausting all options should mean in every local area. We will need every single migrant rough sleeper to be able to access expert benefits and immigration advice. It's great it's happening now in London on the rise. That needs to be happening everywhere. The disparity of rights between EEA and non-EEA nationals needs to be ended, and advice must be accommodated by a bed, a roof over somebody's head, and that needs to be funded by government. Let's not forget that local authorities are on the brink of bankruptcy and they need to be properly funded to be able to provide this support. And we do need data to be collected nationally about migrant homelessness and about restricted eligibility, so that that can support policy and funding decisions. So there's a lot more to do, but I do think the path to ending migrant rough sleeping is clear. I think the recommendations from the Commission are very clear. And finally, on the next slide, we have also, underpinning that, published our own research and recommendations that underpin that Commission's work around those recommendations. And you can hear more about those, as I say, both locally and nationally in the workshop later. And if you would like, Jenny Corbett, I'm going to point to in the room, is the author of that very fine work and sadly left Homeless Link and is now a Greater Manchester Combined Authority, taking this great work to Manchester too. So do have a chat with Jenny. It's not going to be easy. The politics around immigration is pretty toxic and a real significant barrier. But I do have some hope. There has been some progress and there's clear and well-supported roadmap for change nationally and locally. We do have the answers, and this conference, I'm sure, is going to help us to work collectively to flesh those out some more. But we do need to continue to engage, persuade and campaign for decision makers to make that change. And only then will we end migrant rough sleeping for good.
Thank you, Fiona. I think that was a real tour de force, showing us that we know what the answers are, that there's some really good practice going on, but also that there's an incredibly patchy response. I think stressing the importance of the need for 3 elements to tackle this problem: the need for accommodation, food and monetary support, and also the legal support. But the need for simpler, faster processes, because having immigration advice and support for people is brilliant, but actually if the Home Office decision making is still taking months and months, then that continues to be a problem. So I think you've kind of set us up really well for the rest of the discussions. And I just want to, I think, add one thing to that, because the overall environment is very hostile. The rhetoric around migrants, as we've seen with what's been happening in Manston and elsewhere, is very negative. We're really pleased that the language is much more nuanced in terms of the rough sleeping initiative, but there's nothing nuanced about what we're hearing from central government, and particularly from the Home Secretary. And I think it's really important that none of us and the people that we work with and for don't fall into the trap of arguing about who gets a slice of the pie. I think we need to remember that, you know, everyone is a human being. A right to a safe place to stay is a very basic human right. We have got the answers. We do also have the means, I think, to solve this problem. So thank you to everyone for being here and wanting to be part of that solution. I'm not going to say any more. It's your opportunity to ask questions of our panel, I think, including Tom, if he doesn't mind, as he stayed here with us. Bethan.
Take the microphone today.
Okay, and I think we're going to take maybe 3 questions. If you're addressing someone specifically, please do, but otherwise I'll open to the panel to anyone who wants to reply, if that's okay.
Thank
And
you. Hello,
please
everyone.
introduce yourself.
Of course, my name is Athena Magdan from the Romanian Eastern European Hub. As our name says, we are a charity supporting Romanians mainly, but other Eastern European groups as well, including Ukrainian nationals. And this is a question for the panel, really. So we've heard about great initiatives involving local authorities. What we found on the ground level is that we get different responses, which are obviously influenced by the political environment, economical environment, and so on. So beyond the sharing good practice and offering training and the encouragement for local authorities to act better, how can we make sure that they are also accountable for the decisions they are making? And I'm going to give an example where we approached the Deputy Chief Executive of a local council with a population of over 30% being from a European background, mainly Eastern European. saying we need to look at the 5-year strategy and bring in funding into the borough. We're not asking for money, but can we work together? And we got a big fat no. So accountability. And the second issue I wanted to raise is the learnings of Brexit. So we've learned to look at European identities in more depth, and it's multi-layered. For example, Gypsy, Roma traveler groups of an Eastern European background have very specific needs. And we recognize this at, again, grassroots level, frontline service, but at policy level, we're not really sure that data is collected very accurately. So we want to make sure that is also included in the policies that maybe everyone in the panel look at. And it's something we were willing to discuss as a charity providing support to vulnerable people. Thank you.
I'm here, I suppose, as I work on safeguarding adult boards, and this is an area that's a very high on the agenda, particularly in London. Well, safeguarding board. For those of you who don't know what safeguarding adults boards do, which is kind of fair enough, we work across statutory voluntary sectors, looking at adults with care and support needs who are not getting the support they need. So rough sleeping, and particularly migrant rough sleeping, is a very high priority. I think one of the things that is very clear when we see closed cultures, such, within kind of provider sector stuff, where, there's a change in the nature of how people are perceived and seen, and therefore not seen as worthy or whatever else. We see a real kind of bringing together of all the relevant people to kind of tackle those toxic cultures. What worries us as a group of interested independent people who chair the Safeguarding Adults boards is the toxic culture and the toxic and brutal way that we talk about migrants at the moment, and the Home Office policies. We wonder, really, at this point, the moment we have a statutory duty to conduct a safeguarding adult review if an adult with care and support needs dies or suffers serious harm. So we frequently do reviews into the rough sleeper deaths. And we look locally. What happened locally? What was the local decision? How should we change? But actually, what we now need to start thinking about is what's the issue regionally? What's the issue nationally? And does the current brutal and toxic conversation constitute organisational abuse? And I think that's something that really needs to be thought about at very high levels of central government, because actually I want to stay hopeful. My job is to be optimistic and work and find a way of, bringing partners together to achieve this. But I think if we don't change the brutal and the toxic culture at the very top, it's not going to be possible to convince the public at large that this is something that matters to all of us locally, nationally, regionally.
Hi, I'm Madeline Kelleher. I work for Southwark Law Centre, heading up the Southeast region from the project that Michelle was talking about earlier, the rough sleeper. I guess my question is specifically to Jacob about this idea of cross-government, and this. I think there's a lot of buzzwords that use this, cross-government working with DLUC and the homeless and the Home Office. One of the ironies, I think, with the project that I'm working on is that it's great. It's funded by DLUC, and we're trying to address the issue of providing legal advice to rough sleepers. And it's a brilliant project, and there's no denying that. But it's kind of, I'm funded by one branch of the government, and then I'm fighting against another branch of the government, the Home Office, while I'm trying to make applications. What is actually being done, except for these buzzwords of cross-government work and escalation, etc., what work is actually being done by the Home Office to improve this decision-making, and what is actually being promised to DLUC by the Home Office? Because if not, it's just they're never going to achieve the goal of ending it by the Parliament if the fundamental decision-making isn't improved. So I just wanted to know what's being said in the room about that specifically.
Thank you. I think I'm going to direct those questions, if I may, to individual members of the panel. And I think the first question about on the ground, and I'm not going to try and paraphrase the questions because they were quite large and wide ranging, but first question I think was about the difference between on the ground responses from sometimes what's being discussed at this sort of level of developing policy and practice, and the how you can get that accountability. So I'm going to pass that one to Fiona, because you work very much with people on the ground, and hope you can.
Yeah, absolutely. As part of our work as Homeless Link, we are pleased to support national partnerships and be working with local authorities to try to improve local homelessness partnerships. So for us, intelligence is always vital. So the more, if you're a member of Homeless Link and you're aware of particular issues in particular areas, coming through Homeless Link at times is a safe way to raise those issues. We have some routes in to the RSI advisors and can take things up in a way that sometimes local areas, particularly if you're commissioned by a local authority, may not feel entirely comfortable with doing. But I do think that local leadership is vital. And I am a big advocate for political engagement as well as engagement with officers. For my sins, I'm a former local authority councillor, and I always found it really beneficial to hear from local groups what was going on the ground. Your political leaders may not know. If you're speaking to the chief executive, you may well find that political leadership is in blissful ignorance, hearing one side of the story. So I really strongly advocate for local groups to be politically engaged locally, speak to the local cabinet members, speak to your local ward councillors. I think that is true also for the safeguarding question. Local leadership is absolutely vital. It's the thing that we saw distinguishing some local areas from others. An active anti-racist approach is needed, and that will come from local leadership, and it is for the political leadership to set that out. So get engaged, speak to your councillors as well as the chief executives would be my advice on that point.
Okay, great. Thanks, Fiona. I think Michelle's got a few things to add to that.
I was just going to talk about the point you made about data. I don't want to seem like a nerd, but I mean, it's really, really important. So I think one of the things we've done locally is to really try and improve the granularity of the information we know about the different populations and subpopulations through the chain system, which the Mayor funds and provides. We have a tremendous amount of data, but actually it's not that strong. We've done improvements to the way it captures information about immigration status and eligibility. The Delta returns, which local authorities provide to government, also have a lot of questions related to eligibility now and nationality and immigration status. That's only for the past 6 months, I think, that government has been asking for that kind of information from local authorities. And we have a big data project in London, like I say, that we're getting off the ground right now to just try and improve what we know about the populations, who they are, what their needs are, and what their status is, and so that we can organise responses better. Because I think it is a weakness, and you're right to pick us up on it. But I also agree, people vote. So yeah. So the sort of political leadership sometimes is more interested in its population for that very selfish reason.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask Tom particularly, I think, to comment, if you can, on this whole question about the toxic culture. Yeah. And, you know, is it abuse? I think it certainly leads to abuse. That's our experience, but
yeah, no, happy to. Can I just make one comment? First of all, there was a second part to the first questioner's question around the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community. And just to say, the GLA is commissioning for the first time, I think since 2008, a Gypsy, Roma, Traveller accommodation needs assessment. So we've had no data since then on what the accommodation needs of the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community in London are. Obviously one of the most marginalized, and you know, we'll come on to rhetoric in a minute, but you know, the rhetoric around the Gypsy, Roma, Traveller community is particularly toxic. we've actually got a survey which we've extended the deadline. I don't have a link in my mind, but it's on the GLA website, and we're asking organisations that work with the Gypsy Road Traveller community, and indeed the Gypsy and Road and Travellers themselves, to participate in that survey. And I'm sure that we can circulate the link if it's still active following this session. But yes, moving on to the toxic rhetoric. Many years ago, before I was doing this job, before I was doing my previous job, I worked for an anti-racism charity for Hope Not Hate. And I feel very, very strongly about this, and I feel very, very strongly against politicians who have an incredible platform. You know, as a politician, you have a platform, you have a powerful voice, and using that voice quite cynically to demonize communities, because it has real world consequences. We know it has real world consequences. We had a terror attack recently targeting migrant communities. It puts those migrants themselves who are coming here in danger. It puts established migrant communities in danger as well. And so really, I have nothing but contempt for politicians who use this kind of inflammatory rhetoric. It is wrong, and it's dangerous, talking about swarms, floods, invasions, things like that. And just because you believe in border control, in immigration policies, and you don't believe in, you know, open borders, it doesn't mean that you should use your voice to demonize communities. You can believe in border control, but also believe it's very, very important that you do not use language that puts migrant communities in danger, because it does endanger people's lives. So yes, I feel incredibly strongly about that. And just to say on the Home Office, we have made some progress in terms of escalating these cases, but the Home Office is and has been a problem. And, you know, in politics, you know, there's cock up and there's conspiracy. And most of the time, generally when things go wrong, I think it's cock up. In the case of the Home Office, I think it might be both.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to ask Jacob to answer the $5 million question, which is around I suppose the discourse between government departments on this issue. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. And I mean, to kind of state the obvious, like, I'm not going to pretend that this doesn't come in an immensely contentious kind of political context. I don't think I'm going to be able to sort of say here something that's going to satisfy some of the kind of concerns that have been voiced around the rhetoric of politicians. What I can say is the current government has recommitted and is committed to ending rough sleeping by the end of the Parliament. And we don't underestimate, as I said when I was speaking, the challenge when it comes to ending migrant rough sleeping and balancing that against a immigration system, particularly the asylum system, which people have pointed out, that's under immense pressure. And I think that just to like address the kind of central point around kind of, you know, what does cross-government kind of working mean in practice? I think it's a good one. You know, I've outlined kind of what the strategy says in terms of commitments. It was published, you know, 2 months ago. But I think cross-government working is only meaningful when it's delivering outcomes for individuals on the ground. We have Home Office colleagues here today who are going to talk about some of that later. So I kind of won't repeat everything that's said there, but I'll say a few things about, I think, some of the progress that we have made over the last year. As I said, the RSI funding for immigration advice comes in the context of doing practical things on the ground. Home Office have, over the past year, particularly in London, sped up immigration decisions where they know someone is at risk of rough sleeping. That's not always clear when an application is put in, but the escalation route, which I referred to briefly and which Tom has talked about, flagged to caseworking teams that individuals were at risk of rough sleeping and prioritised those decisions. We know that's led to really positive outcomes on the ground. For me, that's kind of the cross-government working in practice, because it delivers outcomes for individuals. Because you're right, ultimately, sort of anything more is just kind of buzzwords. I think there's also an important thing which I'd point out about the Home Office's contribution as well. But again, sort of, I don't want to speak for Home Office colleagues who are in the room, but Home Office do have a specific homelessness team that work on these issues. They are the team that have escalated cases within Home Office, worked with caseworking teams. But I think importantly, they've also come to the table on some of these issues and come to the table on policy as well, where there have been specific policy issues related to, for example, pending applications that have been paused due to pending convictions or prosecutions. Home Office have come to the table and listened to those issues and worked through with partners across London, nationally, to find out if there are solutions within the overall immigration system that I won't pretend isn't kind of highly political and something that, you know, frankly isn't in the control of me as kind of an official. But I would say that I agree with you, like the importance of cross-government working is whether it delivers outcomes. I think that's key. I think that's why all the things that we've set out in the strategy, as I hope I sort of outlined at the beginning, try and build on what we know has worked already and what good practice is in the system. The RSSS, Rough Sleeping Support Service, being moved out of immigration enforcement, recognises some of the difficulties with trust that that's created in the past, also builds on some positive outcomes individually. So, you know, we can do better, we can join up across government better, but I think I'd sort of like a sort of, you know, tentative kind of, you know, make some kind of positive tribute to what Home Office colleagues have done over the past year in terms of practical actions, not just kind of words. We'll hope to kind of turn those commitments into the strategy into kind of practical things over the next few months and in the next year.
Okay, thank you. I believe we've got some questions that have been submitted to us online. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. So we have a question from Angie Allgood online who asks, so much funding, if not all, is ring-fenced to those who are chain verified. What provision could be made available to those who for many reasons will not be verified but do rough sleep?
Okay. I think Michelle's gonna comment on that one.
I'm glad he's not in the room because I'm going to say that's not actually true. So, sorry. I think it has been the case that chain verification has been a sort of golden ticket in the past, but I think we've all recognised that for all groups actually, but as has been said, for migrants, for women, for young people, sleeping visibly in a way that gets you verified by an outreach worker in a busy place where they're likely to walk around isn't always safe. And our approach to verification, chain verification, has very much evolved, I think, over the last couple of years. The immigration advice services that we provide, the accommodation that we offer in London, the cross-London services, do not require you to be chain verified. They work with people at risk of rough sleeping, as well as those people that have been verified as rough sleeping and have a chain number. That was really important to us to make that case, to give that opportunity to work with people to prevent that night or that week on the streets, because it is so dangerous. It's true for, I think, quite a lot of the GLA services in general, moving away from that verification. And we're doing that work at a local authority level too, to say any service you've got that requires you to be chain verified to get into it is actually creating an incentive to sleep rough. And the focus on prevention in the strategy, the work we're doing to better understand the routes people take to get onto the streets, whether it's from an institution or whether it's falling out of accommodation, is so that we can target our services better at people before they hit the streets. So I think that was the case, colleague on the internet, but it's not the case now, and I hope that will be satisfying for you to hear.
Great. I did just want to add in on that from a street link perspective, because Homeless Link along with St Mungo's runs street link, that is very good to hear, but that I have to say I'm not sure an understanding of that has reached down to every level at local authorities. We still see far too many referrals coming through from housing option teams telling people to contact StreetLink and get verified and that they're not going to get helped otherwise. We do need that to stop. So I think there is a job for us to do collectively to try to make sure that that understanding is really shared across local authorities and that's actually happening in practice.
Funny enough, we had several meetings about that last week to look at the actual data of where local authorities have referred to street and said that. And we're going back and saying, do not say this, that's not the case. There's a huge workforce that works in housing options and not all of them are on message all the time. So without making excuses, it's understood and it's appreciated. It shouldn't happen. It does happen sometimes. And we want that to stop. And that's a training issue, which Streetlings are very much engaged with us and the GLA on trying to stamp out.
And apologies to people online, because I should have made sure you had the microphone there, Michelle. I think we probably have time for one or two questions. If you could try and keep them as sort of short and focused, and then we can have some rapid responses from the panel, because we are going to break for coffee at 11:30, and I don't want us to put the whole day back. So,
hello, my name's Joe. I work for Praxis.
hi, Joe.
Hello. I wanted to ask about the use of electronic statuses. We've already seen with the USS that basically everyone is given an electronic status, and I think most people that work with rough sleeping people who have been through the USS would say that they often have huge difficulties accessing and proving that status to access the services they need. And then in the next 2 years, we're looking at spreading that to everyone that has immigration status. And what consideration has been given to the impact that's going to have on homelessness, and also what preparation is in place to deal with it, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Hi everyone, it's Steph from St Mungo's. So I have a question about resources for local authorities. So we know that we want local authorities to exhaust all options. And I know many of us in this room, definitely my teams, are banging on their door saying, this person is owed an assessment under the Care Act, please do it. But we also know that there are 300,000 people on a waiting list for a Care Act assessment, and I believe 1 in 4 has been waiting longer than 6 months. So given that, you know, the people that we're working with are those that have the most complex needs, how can we, you know, we can bang on their doors, we can be sending pre-action letters, we can be bringing in legal advice, but none of that is going to make a difference unless there's someone on the other side that has the resource to be able to do that, fulfill that duty. So I wondered, how can we, is there a plan to try to put that in place?
Okay, thank you. I don't know which of the panel would like to comment first on any of those questions. Michelle?
I'll be honest, I can't answer that very difficult question from colleague at Praxis. I don't know anything about it, so I don't know if anyone else.
I think that's probably for the Home Office, sorry, for the government in the Home Office.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to know sort of like a huge amount about that particular one. Happy to kind of go away and sort of have another discussion. I mean, I'll say a couple of things though. Like first, I think I recognise some of the sort of challenges that you've articulated around, you know, electronic statuses. We've seen through the USS process kind of some of the difficulties that individuals have had where, you know, confirmation has been sent to other people other than themselves and it hasn't reached them and therefore they're not aware of their status. We've, you know, also seen sort of, you know, examples of what you say around electronic statuses, paper statuses, etc., causing some difficulties for individuals. We talk to Home Office regularly about any sort of policy change. It is early days with ministers, I would say. So, you know, the landscape on that is still developing. I think some of the things that we've looked at in the review of the rough sleeping support service are things that might help that sort of issue in future, where issues around individuals not knowing their status or unable to access their status because it's held in a certain place or has been sent somewhere else. Those are issues that can be resolved and are within the aims of what the rough sleeping support service tries to do, i.e., you know, resolve immigration statuses, but also allow individuals to quickly assess what status they have. So you know, I'm happy to go away and sort of like, you know, have a look at the individual kind of thing. I won't have a sort of, I'm not going to kind of talk for Home Office colleagues on that. But I'd say sort of, yeah, really recognise those those challenges.
Yeah, on digital exclusion, I take what Jacob's saying, and I think it's important to come back on it, but I don't think we should expect as a sector that we're going to see a path back on sort of digital status, and we've seen it in universal credit and welfare benefits, and it's really important for us to get a grasp on what we can do to help support people through digital inclusion projects, through services and support that we can provide in our day services and centres. On resources, Steph, great and very important question. It's really important that we, to some extent, not always, but we do agree with local authorities on the need for resources for local authorities as well as directly for the sector. If there isn't enough money in the local authority sector, we aren't going to see the change that we need. Homeless Link's been working very closely with the LGA. We had a roundtable about the cost of living crisis and about the funding crisis for local authorities and the homelessness sector. We know that 1 in 4 of our members told us in the summer that they feared that their services would have to be cut back or closed. There is a crisis of funding. We're campaigning. Please do visit our campaign webpage. It's called Keep Our Doors Open for homelessness services. Budget tomorrow, but I don't think that's going to bring us great news. So that campaign is going to have to continue. But I think this is somewhere where we have common ground with local authorities, and we should be working together as much as we can for more resources into local government and specifically into homelessness.
Well, just in terms of resourcing, I think I saw recently that something like 1 in 6 councils in London is on the in the country is on the verge of issuing a Section 114 notice, i.e., declaring themselves bankrupt. The situation in local government is absolutely dire. I mean, I used to be a councillor on Lewisham Council. Lewisham Council post 2010 lost 60% of its funding. People talk about cutting fat. There is no fat left to cut in local government. And, unless something's done about that in the budget on the 17th, services that have already been cut back that people rely upon are going to suffer even further. So resourcing is going to be absolutely crucial.
Okay, a final comment on that, Michelle?
I mean, you would expect me to agree. I mean, it's a whole sort of system, isn't it, really? So I mean, we talked about the fact that we've got this funding for immigration advice, and then when we move into the space of talking about welfare rights, which Steph will know well, we're scrabbling around talking to local authorities, and the welfare rights and welfare benefits advice was all cut from 2010 to 2020, and there's nothing left. So when we try and get into that space, it's missing. So as fast as we put money in and try and get resource, the homelessness prevention grant, there was a consultation about changes to the homelessness prevention grant, and the formula would have disadvantaged London hugely. Almost half of the homelessness prevention grant from government to local authorities to deal with homelessness, not rough sleeping, just in general, would have had a huge impact if that's adopted in our inability to do lots of prevention work that we need to do to prevent rough sleeping. So there's no place really where rough sleeping services are very well resourced, but we are part of a system, and that system includes social care, and it includes mainstream homelessness prevention and advice, and tenancy support services, and also mediation services, all sorts of services which prevent homelessness, which haven't been funded as well as rough sleeping services have. So yeah, resourcing is an issue. Demand is growing and resource is not. So.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle, and to the rest of the panel. I think that's been a really interesting discussion, and we've gone from the kind of optimism and energy about how much progress we've made to end, I think, with setting very firmly the very challenging context that we're working in, whether that's from the hostile rhetoric that we face and that's whipping up a very strong kind of anti-migrant sentiment, to the big issues of digital exclusion, which are going to affect many, which are already affecting many people, both migrants and those who have least access or ability to work online, to the very big question or the very big problem that we're facing, which is around shrinking public services. And I think to speak up for the charity sector, I think the charity sector has always been seen as being there to kind of mop up people who somehow fall out of statutory support, or indeed providing statutory services, commissioned services. But the charity sector cannot deal with the crises that we're facing across the country. We can all work together the best we can, focus on the little bits that we are working on, and meanwhile try and find and fight for the bigger solutions. So I think it's really important that we don't go away feeling that this is beyond our ability to change things. We can change things. We can build alliances for change. Please join Praxis's campaigns, which are about making things better for migrants, but we want to make things better for everyone. And meanwhile, we'll all keep working together. And I think it's fantastic that we've got representatives from government, from local government, all committed to ending the problem of migrant destitution and homelessness within the ambit of homelessness generally. Nobody should be homeless. So thank you all for your work on this. Thank you for coming to the conference today. And let's keep moving forwards and make the world a better place. And thank you very much to our speakers. And enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
We now have a 15-minute coffee break, after which the workshop sessions will start. We decided not to pin you to an allocated workshop, so you're free to go where you want. This is the George Fox room. Elizabeth Fry room is to our left. Marjorie Sykes room is downstairs.
Kind of they were fairly gentle. I know, but